Okay, before we can do any psychology experiments, you guys have got to learn about the experimental method. So, what does the spec say? This part of the spec asks you to understand the aims, stating aims, the difference between aims and hypotheses, directional and non-directional hypotheses, the independent and dependent variables, and operationalization of those variables. So, let's go with a kind of theory. So we have a theory that energy drinks affect how much people talk. This is based on our understanding of having read a few research studies on the internet about what they contain. So we have an initial idea, and the next step is that we need to get an aim. So an aim is a general statement that describes the purpose of the investigation. It's not providing any prediction, it's just a general statement about what you're going to do. The prediction is our hypothesis, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So what could our aim be? Our aim could investigate the drinking speed up on the amount a person talks. So now we need to formulate our hypothesis. This is a statement that is made at the start of the study and clearly states what the relationship is going to be between the variables. So basically what we think is going to happen. So for example, our hypothesis could be drinking speed up causes people to become more talkative. There are two types of hypothesis, and you won't find this bit in the book, okay? They are the alternate hypothesis, and this is what you expect to happen. So if we think it's going to make more people more talkative, this is what we're going to say. We say we think people are going to become more talkative. It will contain the IV and the DV. The other hypothesis is a null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the one that predicts there'll be no effect going to happen. Now, if I do my experiment and I'm correct and people are more talkative, then I accept my alternate hypothesis. If I'm not correct and actually they were less talkative, then that's when I would accept my null hypothesis. Okay? I'm telling you about the null hypothesis because it is something that you will need to know later on, although you won't get asked questions on it just yet. The alternate hypothesis is split into two types. The first one is your directional hypothesis. This is when we think we know what's going to happen. And this type of hypothesis would be saying things like more, less, higher, lower, faster, slower. So in the case of our people drinking the speed up, we would say people who drink speed up become more talkative than people who don't. Okay, people who drink water are less talkative. So it's that more or less because it's giving us a direction. We know where that's actually going. The other type is a non-directional hypothesis. This is when we simply think there's going to be a difference between our two groups, our two conditions. So for example, people who drink speed up differ in terms of talkativeness compared to people who don't drink speed up. So we think there's going to be a difference between the two. So how do we know what type of hypothesis to use? When do we use a directional and when do we do a non-directional? Well, we tend to use a directional hypothesis when we already know something about it. So, for example, in the case of our energy drink, we already know that the energy drink can have an effect on people's talkativeness. So in this case, we would use a directional hypothesis. When there's no previous research, so we don't know anything about it at all, that's when we tend to use a non-directional hypothesis. These sometimes can be called a one-tailed and a two-tailed hypothesis. Okay, a directional hypothesis is one-tailed. That means we only think it's going into one direction. A non-directional is two-tailed. We're not sure whether they're going to be more or less talkative, for example. Okay? The two-tailed hypothesis is less accurate because we're not certain. Next, we're going to move on to variables. There are two types of variables. They're your IV and your DV. Now, hopefully you'll have heard of these before when you did science. Your IV is the thing that you are changing. Okay? It's the thing that you manipulate. The DV is what you're going to measure. Okay? There are other variables that might affect your DV, and we have to try and keep them as constant as possible so we can be sure that it's the change in our IV that has caused the change in our DV. So, levels of IV. What this basically means is that we're going to have more than one condition. Okay, we need something to compare our experimental group against. Okay, so for example, all right, we would have two conditions. One where they had the energy drink, which is our experimental condition, and one where they had no energy drink, and this would be our control condition. A well-written hypothesis should make it easy to tell what the IV and the DV are, and what's our experimental group and what's our control group. But also, we need to make sure that it's very clear what our IV and our DV are and what we are measuring. And this is when we have to operationalise our variables. Okay, because sometimes, for example, if I was just measuring energy drink, and I had a condition, and in my experimental condition, some of them had 1 can, some of them had 2 cans, some of them had 3 cans, it would be very unclear as to the effects of that energy drink. So I would need to make sure it was clear in my hypothesis how much energy drink my participants were having. So, for example, I could say my IV was drinking 1 can of Speed Up and no cans of Speed Up. And my DV, for example, so how can I measure talkativeness? Okay, it could be the number of words spoken in a minute. All right, so it's making it very clear what I am measuring and what I am changing. Right, so let's look at how to write a good hypothesis. The first thing you need to do is make sure the IV and the DV are clear and measurable. This means that you have operationalised them. You must make sure that the relationship between the IV and the DV are not stated as an aim, and you have to decide whether you're going to use a directional or non-directional. Remember, you use a directional hypothesis when you have previous research to tell you what it's about. So, here's some examples. The hypothesis states that there will be more words spoken in 5 minutes by the participants drinking the 300 ml of Speed Up compared to the participants who drank 300 ml of water. So this is a directional hypothesis because we're looking at the word more. I've got my DV. It's clear that the DV is words spoken in 5 minutes. And then I've got my IV. And that again is fully operationalised, 300 ml of Speed Up. The next one, hypothesis states there will be no difference in the number of words spoken. Now this is a non-directional hypothesis. Okay, this is because I'm saying there's not going to be any difference between my clearly operationalised IVs, 300 ml of water and 300 ml of Speed Up. Okay. I would always try and use that formula. Put your DV first and say whether it's more or less or whether there's going to be no difference, and then say what your two conditions are, your experimental and your control condition. So now we're going to look at an exam question, and first off we need to identify the IV and the DV. So, a psychologist carried out an experiment using an independent group design. The psychologist wished to investigate the effectiveness of a strategy for memory improvement. In condition 1, the participants were taught one memory improvement strategy, and the other they were not taught. So our IV here is the memory improvement strategy. The participants then asked to memorise 10 pictures of familiar objects. For example, the first was a doll, the second was an apple. All participants were given 50 pictures each and asked to select their original 10. So our DV, what we're measuring, is how well they remember the original 10 objects. Okay, so our hypothesis might look like, the hypothesis states that there will be a difference in the number of objects correctly identified between those who were taught a memory strategy and those who were not. This is a non-directional, so I'm just saying there's a difference. It's clear what my DV is, it's the number of objects correctly identified, and my IV is those who were taught memory strategy and those who were not. Apologies, that should be the 2.